The sun had barely risen when Harold Thompson, 65 years old, stepped into the office for what should have been one of his final peaceful days. For 40 years, Harold had given his life to this company. Early mornings, late nights, missing family moments, pushing through sickness, all to make the company grow. But today felt different. The atmosphere was cold, almost bitter. His co-workers avoided his eyes. He didn't understand. He placed his old leather briefcase on his desk, the one he'd carried every day since his first job interview. Then the phone on his desk rang sharply. His heart jumped. Slowly, he picked it up. "Harold, come to the conference room immediately." The voice of Mr. Collins, the CEO, barked coldly. Harold's hands trembled. He wiped a tear already forming in his eye. He had dedicated his entire life to this place. Surely, this wasn't what it seemed. As he walked to the conference room, the weight in his chest grew heavier. His heart pounded louder than his footsteps. He opened the door, and there they were. 5 executives, eyes cold as ice, and the termination letter on the table. Harold's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the chair, his legs weak beneath him. Slowly, he sat down, his hands shaking as he looked at the letter. Bold, cruel letters stared back at him. Termination. Effective immediately. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Gentlemen, there must be some mistake. I have only 2 weeks left till retirement." Mr. Collins didn't blink. His words were sharp like knives. "Harold, it's not personal. We're restructuring. And frankly, we can't afford your retirement package." Tears filled Harold's eyes, blurring the paper in front of him. He had worked through holidays, sacrificed time with his family, and given every ounce of strength for this company. "You mean to save a few dollars, you're throwing me away?" His voice broke, raw with pain. The room was silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Another executive, younger, almost half Harold's age, shrugged carelessly. "It's just business, Harold. You'll understand." Harold clenched his fists beneath the table, his heart shattering. But deep inside, beneath the pain, something stronger began to stir, a small burning fire. They didn't know it yet. Harold had a secret. As Harold sat in the cold room, a storm brewed quietly inside him. They thought he was weak, finished, powerless. But they were wrong. For years, Harold had watched the company from the inside. He had seen the lies, the hidden accounts, the quiet betrayals of both employees and loyal clients. He had spent his late nights gathering documents, emails, and contracts. Carefully, quietly, like a man planting seeds for a stormy harvest. The executives in the room laughed softly, already talking about his replacement. They had no idea. With trembling hands, Harold closed the termination letter and placed it neatly back on the table. He stood up, his spine straightening, his old heart beating with a new strength. "Thank you for making your intentions clear," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made them glance at each other nervously. They thought they had ended him, but Harold was just beginning. As he walked out of the conference room, he gripped the folder hidden inside his briefcase, the folder that held everything, the proof, the secret weapon. And in that moment, Harold knew justice was coming. They were going to regret this. Harold's steps were heavy as he walked back to his desk, but his mind was racing faster than ever. The folder inside his old briefcase felt heavier now, almost burning in his hand. Years of quiet work, pages filled with secrets. He had not collected these papers for revenge. At first it was only to protect himself, but now it felt like destiny. As Harold sat down at his desk across the room, he could still hear the executives laughing in the conference room. Their cruel voices felt like sharp blades cutting into his heart. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he did not wipe them away. He let them fall. He wanted to feel every ounce of the pain, because he knew it would make the victory even sweeter. He carefully opened the folder, seeing copies of hidden deals, backroom contracts, and illegal schemes. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of justice soon to come. "They think they can break me," Harold whispered to himself, his voice filled with quiet fire. "But they have no idea." His eyes, once full of sorrow, now burned with a new purpose. As Harold stared at the papers, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the sleepless nights. He remembered missing his daughter's wedding because of an urgent company meeting. He remembered spending Christmases alone at his desk, while others celebrated at home, all because the company told him, "You are the backbone of this place." They called him loyal. They called him family. But today they threw him away like an old broken tool. His heart ached deeply, as if it were being crushed in his chest. Tears blurred his vision again, falling onto the papers in front of him. "I gave them my life," Harold whispered, barely holding back his sobs. "I gave them everything." His fingers gripped the folder tighter, smudging some of the ink with his tears. But he didn't stop. No, not now. He would not let them bury him quietly. This moment was no longer about money. It was about his dignity. It was about justice. And no matter how broken he felt, he would rise. Because a man with nothing to lose has everything to fight for. Harold looked around the office one more time. The place he had called home for 40 years felt like a stranger's house now. Desks were empty, the lights too bright, the silence too loud. He watched the young managers chatting near the coffee machine, laughing about weekend plans, not caring about the man who had built the very foundation under their feet. For a brief moment, Harold felt weak again. Doubt tried to creep into his mind. What if they win? What if they bury this like they buried me? But then he remembered his family's faces. His wife, who stood by him through every long night. His grandchildren, who always asked, "Grandpa, why do you work so hard?" For them he had worked. For them he would fight. Harold took a deep breath. His heart still ached, but his hands were steady now. He closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and stood tall. It was time, not for revenge alone, but for justice, for every worker they had betrayed. As he walked toward the CEO's office, his footsteps grew stronger. They fired Harold Thompson, but they forgot one thing. Harold wasn't finished yet. Harold stood tall at the door of the CEO's office. His heart thudded in his chest, loud like a drum. He could feel the weight of 40 years pressing down on his shoulders. Inside, Mr. Collins sat comfortably in his leather chair, a smirk on his face. Next to him, the younger executives chuckled as if they had already won. Harold stepped inside, calm but burning with quiet fire. "Mr. Thompson," Collins greeted without respect. "What brings you here? You should be clearing your desk." Harold's eyes, tired but sharp, locked onto his. "I have something to show you," Harold replied, laying the folder gently on the desk. Collins didn't bother to look at it. "It won't change anything, old man." Harold's lips trembled, but he spoke firmly. "I believe it will." He opened the folder, revealing page after page of evidence. Illegal deals, hidden profits, names, dates, signatures. The room fell silent. The smirks disappeared. Collins' face turned pale as he grabbed a paper, reading it with shaking hands. Harold stood still, his heart pounding, knowing this moment was just the beginning. He had just dropped the first hammer, and they never saw it coming. The executives' laughter faded into nervous whispers. One by one, they leaned in, eyes wide, reading the documents. Sweat formed on Mr. Collins's forehead. His lips, once so smug, pressed into a tight, pale line. This can't be real," Collins stammered. But it was real. Every word, every number, every signature. Harold had kept records for years, quietly, carefully, like a man planting seeds for a storm. Harold's voice remained calm, but firm. "I warned you about your greed. You ignored me. I gave you 40 years of my life and you threw me out like garbage." One of the younger executives tried to defend himself. This was before my time," Harold's gaze cut him down. Yet you enjoyed the dirty fruits of it. Collins slammed the papers shut, trying to look strong, but his hands betrayed him, shaking like leaves in the wind. Harold, he forced a fake smile. We can discuss this privately. Harold shook his head slowly. His voice was like thunder in a quiet storm. No more secrets. No more lies. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. Harold was no longer the victim. He was the judge. And justice had arrived. Harold could see the fear in their eyes now. It was the same fear he had felt when they handed him that cruel letter. But today, the tables had turned. You think firing me saves your bonus? Harold's voice grew stronger, sharper. You forgot what I've been quietly building. He opened the folder further, revealing one final document. A sealed letter addressed to the board of directors. This goes straight to the top, Harold declared. Every dirty secret you've hidden, every loyal employee you've betrayed, every lie you've told. Collins's mask of confidence shattered. His voice shook. Harold, wait. Let's be reasonable. Harold's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of justice. For 40 years I was reasonable, he replied, his voice breaking with deep emotion, while you took everything from me. Silence filled the room like heavy fog. Then, with a steady hand, Harold placed the sealed letter on the table and slid it across. You have one chance, he said softly. Fix this, or I let the truth free. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of 4 decades of sacrifice. The men in the room sat frozen. Harold stood, tall and unshaken. The storm was only beginning. The room felt like it had frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mr. Collins, usually so confident, now looked like a scared child. His hands shook as he reached for the sealed letter. He knew if this reached the board, it would be the end for him, and every man in that room. Harold, Collins said, his voice weak. Let's talk about this. We can find a solution. Harold's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. You had 40 years to treat me right. Now you want to talk? Collins forced a nervous smile. Maybe we were too quick. Maybe you don't have to leave the company after all. We'll give you your bonus, your full retirement. The others nodded quickly, their faces pale with fear. But Harold shook his head. It's not about the money anymore. His eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained firm. It's about respect. About every man and woman you treated like dirt. He placed his hand on the letter again, looking them straight in the eye. You can't buy back dignity. The air in the room grew heavy. They were trapped. Harold, once their victim, now held all the power. Silence filled the room, heavy like a thick cloud. Harold could see it, the fear in their eyes growing stronger with every second. You thought you could fire me quietly, Harold continued, his voice stronger now. End my story here. But you forgot one thing. He opened the folder wider, revealing one last page. It was a letter, written in his own shaky handwriting, addressed directly to the government labor board. Every illegal action, every stolen bonus from workers like him, was written clearly. Collins's face turned ghost white. Harold, please, Collins begged, sweat dripping from his forehead. We can fix this. Harold's heart ached. He thought of his wife waiting at home, believing he'd have a peaceful retirement. He thought of the workers, many of them older, who had been fired with no justice. No, Harold said simply. You fixed nothing. Collins dropped into his chair, his hands shaking. You broke the trust. You broke lives. Harold's tears fell as he spoke, his voice trembling but filled with power. Now, it's time you feel the same pain. For the first time, the bosses knew they were no longer in control. Harold was leading the final chapter. With slow, steady hands, Harold picked up the sealed letter. The weight of it felt like the weight of 40 long years. He stepped closer to the table, placed it right in front of Collins, and tapped it twice. You open this, Harold said softly, or I will. Collins looked at his fellow executives. All their faces were pale, full of regret. But it was too late for regret now. One of the younger men, his voice shaky, tried to speak. "Mr. Thompson, maybe we can—" Harold raised his hand, stopping him. "You spent years stealing from people like me," Harold said, his voice filled with deep sorrow. "You think you can erase that with words?" Tears filled Harold's eyes, but he didn't look away. "You cannot." Collins slowly reached for the letter, his fingers trembling. His lips quivered as he stared at Harold. "Please," Collins whispered. "What do you want?" Harold took a deep breath. He thought of every sacrifice he had made, every holiday missed, every birthday forgotten. "I want justice," Harold answered, with tears running down his cheeks. "For me. For every worker you hurt." The room fell into deep silence. The battle was no longer for Harold alone. It was for them all. Harold stood tall, though his knees felt weak, but not from fear, from the weight of 40 years of pain now rising to the surface. Collins stared at the letter like it was a bomb about to explode. "You don't have to do this, Harold," Collins pleaded, his voice shaking. "We'll give you everything. Your bonus, your retirement, even more." Harold's eyes, wet with tears, locked onto him. "You think this is about money?" His voice cracked but didn't break. He let the tears flow because they were honest. They were real. "It's about every man and woman who trusted you, who gave you their life, only to be thrown aside like garbage." The other executives shifted in their chairs, looking down in shame. For the first time, they saw Harold not as an old man, but as a mountain standing before them. Harold's hand stayed firm on the letter. "My fear died the moment you fired me," Harold said, his voice deep with pain and power. "What lives in me now is something you cannot buy." Collins swallowed hard. He knew they had crossed the point of no return. Harold was no longer their employee. He was their reckoning. Collins' voice turned to begging. "Harold, let's not destroy everything." But Harold stayed silent, staring at the sealed letter like it carried the weight of 1,000 voices. He could hear them in his heart. The janitor laid off after 20 years. The secretary denied her pension. The factory worker forced out before retirement. They were all with him in that moment. "You already destroyed everything," Harold finally replied, his voice sharp as glass. "You destroyed trust. You destroyed loyalty." Collins's hands trembled as he reached again for the letter, but Harold pulled it away. "You don't get to touch this," Harold said firmly. "Not anymore." The younger executives glanced nervously at each other. The room, once filled with pride and power, now felt like a sinking ship. Harold's old, tired hands held more power than all of them combined. With steady fingers, he opened the letter, revealing the first line of his complaint to the government. The truth was no longer hidden. "You stole from every one of us," Harold continued, his voice rising. "But today, we take it back." His tears fell freely, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of victory. Harold placed the open letter on the table, the words like fire to their eyes. For a moment, the room fell into a deep, heavy silence. So heavy, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Collins's face was pale, his lips trembling. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Harold, with a voice filled with quiet thunder, broke the silence. "You thought I was alone," he said, looking at each of them. "But I carry every worker you betrayed." His voice shook, but not from fear, from deep, burning emotion. "For every birthday I missed," Harold continued, his eyes misty. "For every night I worked late while you laughed in this room." The men hung their heads low. There was no escape now. Harold pressed the letter flat on the table, his hand steady. "I will not let you bury this." Tears ran freely down his cheeks, landing on the paper, but he did not wipe them away. They were tears of truth. Harold's heart pounded with strength. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment when justice stood taller than greed. The battle was no longer coming. The battle was here. Harold stood tall, his chest rising and falling slowly. The silence in the room felt heavier than any words. Collins finally broke. He dropped into his chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "Harold, please," Collins whispered, voice thin and weak. But Harold didn't flinch. "You had 40 years to treat me like a man," Harold replied softly. "Today, I speak for every worker you cast aside." Tears welled in his eyes, but they didn't fall from sadness anymore. They were tears of justice. "You fired me for a bonus," Harold continued. 2 weeks before I could rest, before I could see my grandchildren smile without worrying about bills. The younger executives looked away, ashamed. "Now," Harold said, placing both hands on the table, "your time is up." With one firm motion, he slid the letter closer to Collins. "This is going to the board, to the government, to the people." Collins buried his face in his hands. No words could save them now. Harold, once the quiet worker they ignored, now stood as a giant before them, and they had nowhere left to run. The storm had finally come. Harold's voice cut through the silence like thunder. "You took everything from me, but you forgot one thing." He paused, looking at each man, making sure they saw the fire in his eyes. "You forgot that a man with nothing left is the most dangerous man of all." Collins's face was wet with sweat. He trembled as he reached for the papers again, but Harold pushed them further away. "No," Harold said firmly. "You don't get to decide anymore." With slow, steady hands, Harold pulled out his old phone and pressed record. His voice, raw and emotional, filled the room. "This is my story," Harold said, looking into the camera. 40 years of loyal service, ended in greed. But today, justice speaks. Collins and his men looked horrified as they realized Harold was making his words public. "This video will be seen by every worker you betrayed," Harold continued, his voice strong. "Every family you hurt, every heart you broke. The truth would no longer be buried." Harold, the man they once tried to silence, had become the voice of thousands. The bosses sat frozen. The power was no longer theirs. It belonged to Harold. Harold ended the recording and placed his phone down gently, like it was a trophy earned through years of pain. His hands were trembling, but not from fear, from relief, from justice. "You tried to take away my ending," Harold said, tears falling down his cheeks. "But you only gave me a new beginning." Collins, pale and broken, couldn't speak. His empire of greed had crumbled in minutes. Harold gathered his folder and stood tall. For the first time in years, his back straightened with pride. "I may have lost my job," Harold said, voice shaking with emotion, "but I found my voice." He turned to leave the room, but paused at the door. Looking back one last time, he said quietly, "For every worker you hurt, remember this day." And with that, Harold walked out, leaving behind not just his past, but a message that would echo far beyond the walls of that office. The battle was over. Harold had won, but not just for himself, for everyone. Dear friends watching this story, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, I ask you, please, before you leave this video, click that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. And most importantly, drop a comment below. Tell me, did Harold's fight make you cry? Did it remind you of someone you know? Or your own life? Let's fill this comment section with love, with stories of strength, and with respect for every hard-working soul out there. Your comments mean the world to me. They keep these stories alive. Together, let's stand with Harold, and with every worker who gave their life for their family. I'll be waiting to read your beautiful messages. Thank you.